Good afternoon and welcome to the Alfred University Bergren Forum. My name is John D'Angelo and I am Professor of Chemistry and Coordinator for the Spring 2024 season of the Bergren Forum. Today is Thursday, February 8th, 2024, and for those of you attending the forum online from far, far away, here in Western New York, it is a beautiful, sunny, almost spring-like day, and inside Nevins Theater or the Powell Campus Center, at least for February, it is inexplicably colder feeling than it is outside. Before starting, we have a few announcements. First, next Thursday's forum will be given by Alfred State Assistant Professor of Digital Media and Animation, Luke Bernfeld. Luke's talk will be on input methods in digital game discourse. There are some other events this week to announce. First, tomorrow, February 9th, will be the opening reception for an art exhibition by Leland Janis and Ellis Lemkaliak titled The Stakes Are Higher, Never Well Done. The reception will be in the Robert C. Turner Gallery from 6 to 8 p.m. Also, on Saturday from 3 to 5 p.m., the Institute of Cultural Unity's CLAS Dean's Office and the Division of Modern Languages will be co-sponsoring a celebration of the Lunar New Year, the Year of the Dragon, at the community table right here in the Powell Campus Center. There will be food, music, and a dragon dance. Finally, starting next week, we will be broadcasting as a simulcast an enhanced Bergren Forum on the YouTube channel. I will soon be updating the calendar invite to contain a link to this for those of you interested in attending next week's forum that way. A link to both the Zoomcast and YouTube will be provided on Alfred today as part of next week's announcement. I'm delighted that there are so many students here this week supporting one of your own. And so today's third episode of the Bergren Forum will be given by Alfred University student Lio Bonaccio. The title of the talk is How Do We Preserve Indigenous Culture and Language? The floor is yours.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for showing up. Today, like John just said, I'll be talking about the preservation of Indigenous culture and language. I will be talking about points that I think can aid and lead the way to actively preserving said culture successfully, as well as disparities Indigenous peoples around the world still face to this day, and why it is important we learn and educate ourselves on these disparities in order to take steps forward to avoid repeating history. That's when I go to my next. Okay, so a little bit about me. I'm an undergrad. I'm a senior art history major, currently the only art history major in the whole school. I'm an English minor. That's why a lot of the English faculty are here today. Thank you for supporting me. I'm specializing in photography right now and its representation of Indigenous people. I'm looking at photographer Edward S. Curtis in comparison to modern Indigenous photographer Will Wilson. I recently learned that 15.4% of Indigenous peoples have a bachelor's. I'm first gen, and so I'm going to be adding to that percentage. Woo woo. Yes. My grandmother is Siksika, and my grandfather is Taino, both on my mom's side. I grew up in Hell's Kitchen, New York. My grandma left the reservation at a really young age. She had her first kid at 16 and then went on to have 11 more kids, and she moved to the Bronx. As a city Indian, I've often felt like super disconnected from my culture. And my family has also felt the repercussions of displacement and sadly residential school. I've also recently found out that only 1.15% of anthropologists are Indigenous and or American Indian, which is really upsetting and makes sense as to why most of my sources for this semester for my thesis are by white scholars. So last semester, I did an independent study with Professor Carrie Kautzman on Indigenous language revitalization. In my research, I found that preservation efforts lacked a sense of collaboration with Indigenous peoples. Professor Kautzman and I then discussed how I, as an Indigenous person, would go about putting my own list together that I think would put Indigenous peoples at the forefront so we can preserve our own history and culture. Often we are case studies for white scholars and institutions, and I find myself asking questions such as, how do we go about amplifying Indigenous voices respectfully? And what are the specific roadblocks that are keeping Indigenous people's voices from being amplified? Throughout the presentation, I will also have slides with quotes on them from Indigenous artists, activists, and literary scholars that I encourage you guys to look into after the presentation. I would like to give a special thanks to Carrie Kautzman and Melissa Ryan for helping me so much with the editing and overall concept of this Bergren. Thank you for being the first professors I've ever encountered to include indigenous scholars within your curriculum. You've really inspired me. So how do we go about defining preservation? That's obviously a word I'm going to be using a lot within this talk. So I think it's appropriate that we all know the definition of it. Merriam-Webster defines it as the act, process, or result of preserving something, such as the activity or process of keeping something valued alive, intact, or free from damage or decay. There's often a preconceived notion that preservation requires the help and necessities of historians, that it is something that needs institutional and bureaucratic intervention, when in reality, it is something that Indigenous people are at the forefront of. We must be able to gain control of our own means of cultural transmissions and education. This is something I will touch upon later in isolated examples. Keep in mind, just because someone is not an academic or scholar does not mean that they are not knowledgeable to speak on education on certain topics. I believe that most of the time, lived experiences outweigh academic research. So if we take into account factors such as the loss of language due to colonization and the displacement of Indigenous peoples, it is accurate to conclude that many Indigenous cultures and tribes are being virtually erased from history. Recognizing this raises questions such as, what are the right ways to preserve culture and language? The GIF on the left is an accurate depiction of land taken by Indigenous peoples by colonizers over time in America. The end result is present-day reservation land. And it's not working. So that's kind of sad. But I'm going to give you guys statistics so you can visualize it. Approximately 2.3% of American land is reservation land. So in other words, that's the totality of Idaho, which is kind of depressing. So I'm going to be using the word displacement a lot. So I'll be briefly covering what it means. The Collins Dictionary defines displacement as the removal of something from its usual place or position by something which then occupies that place or position. Indigenous culture is almost entirely based on relationship to land. With the creation of reservations in 1851, along with the creation of residential schools in 1883, this forced Indigenous people to assimilate, and many Indigenous people were displaced and forced out of their homelands. Another example of this is the Long Walk of the Navajo, or more famously, the Trail of Tears. The Long Walk of the Navajo occurred in August of 1864, in which the Diné people were forcibly removed from their land by the American government. As a result of colonial expansion and ethnic cleansing. The Diné people walked 300 miles at gunpoint. In other words, this is 18 days of continuous walking. The government and army believed that the Navajo on a reservation far from the haunts and hills and hiding places of their country, they would acquire new habits, new ideas, and new modes of life. In other words, civilizing them. A quote by James Henry Carlston, an officer who participated in the Navajo Roundup, states, "The young ones will take their places without these longings, and thus little by little, they will become a happy, contented people." This is one of the quotes. It's by Elba Anaka Lugo, who is a leader and organizer of the Taino movement in Puerto Rico. She also led one of the first Taino symposiums. And the quote reads, "Everything evolves, but we must maintain our essence always. We are not extinct because within me that essence is alive." So, how do we preserve Indigenous cultures and languages successfully? As I mentioned earlier, this is the list I composed with the help of Professor Kautzman, and this is what I believe are some of the steps that can lead to successful language and culture preservation. So number one would be the ease of access to learn and revitalize language and the inclusiveness of the tribal language. Number two, shared values of a community that are passed down from generation to generation. Number three, preserving and returning Indigenous artifacts while including a means to learn about Indigenous creative practices within museums. Number four is awareness and action. And number five is decolonizing spaces and the act of land back. So number one, for this example, I will be using Taino specifically. Although Taino was once considered a dead language, at least by Cambridge dictionaries, which the definition is a language no longer used by communication, it is currently in the process of a modern revitalization. There are over 800 Spanish words that originate from Taino and over 3,000 Taino words spoken in the Spanish of the Caribbean, proving that the language was not entirely extinguished. It is important to note that although language evolves and changes over time, we see this with modern day slang, for example, the recognition of Taino as an extinct language is purely due to colonialism and the active erasure of indigenous peoples in the Caribbean. Its endangerment and extinction is also due to an obvious language hierarchy implemented by colonialism. Language is ultimately connected to its people. It has been historically proven that there was an active purpose to erase all signs and culture of the Taino within Latin America and the Caribbean. Often when looking into recordings and accounts of indigenous language, we look to the accounts of the colonizers. So a good example of this would be, I remember in elementary school, we were often quoting or looking at the diaries of Christopher Columbus instead of the views of indigenous people. One quote I really like is, if colonizers didn't record it or take accurate accounts, how can we be sure it's truly Taino? This quote in and of itself is a colonizer mindset. We have to be open to both viewpoints. Another example of active Taino erasure that ultimately led to the downfall of Taino as a language, even though it's being revitalized now, is the paper genocide. And the paper genocide means that a people can be literally made to disappear on paper. So the 1787 census in Puerto Rico lists 2,300 pure Indians in the population. But on the next census in 1802, there was not a single Indian listed. This is a little suspicious, if you ask me. Once something is put down on paper, there's almost nothing you can do to change it with our bureaucratic system. Moreover, a 2003 study funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation revealed that 61% of Puerto Ricans have American Indian mitochondrial DNA. After decades of being criticized as fake Indians, the Taino were finally able to claim their indigenous identity in the 2010 U.S. Census. This tactic, fun fact, was also used in the United States as well. Indigenous peoples would be marked as colored instead of indigenous to feed into the myth of the vanishing race. So who are the Taino people? The Taino people are a first contact tribe, meaning although the tribe was the first to undergo ethnic cleansing and genocide in 1492, it is not so well known that many of those in the tribe were able to survive by escaping to hills and mountainous terrain. Leading to belief in syncretism and a spread of language and culture to other now closely related tribes. Geneticists found evidence of DNA survival, and as I said earlier, about 61% of modern day Puerto Ricans carry Taino DNA. The modern day Taino movement happened within the late 19th century, and a quote I really like from the book Taino Revival, Critical Perspectives on Puerto Rican Identity and Cultural Politics reads, "The Tainos became a symbol of Puerto Rican identity at the end of the 19th century when local governments and nationalistic intellectuals began to appropriate the Tainos for the conception of a socially and racially balanced Puerto Rican society. Activists in the Puerto Rican diaspora revitalized the idea." So in 1998, the UCTP was created. The UCTP is the United Confederation of Taino People, and it's an indigenous representative institution that promotes self-determination and protection of human rights, cultures, traditions, and sacred lands of Taino and other Caribbean indigenous peoples. However, there's been a lot of bureaucratic issues with the UCTP because they don't count as federally recognized. Therefore, the government doesn't count them as indigenous at all, basically. You can get a card, but it really wouldn't mean anything other than that you're a part of this group. So how are we going about revitalizing language today? Well, one person I had the pleasure of working with was Priscilla Colon, and she's one of many Taino people who dedicate their time to teach and make known the Taino culture and language. Colon uses Javier Hernandez's book, Primerio Básico del Taino Boricanaki, hacia la restauración del idioma ancestral de Borican, as her main source to teach Taino languages courses for free on her YouTube channel. So I mentioned earlier that it would be great if language was more accessible, and she's actively doing that, which I think is beautiful. Her main goal is to keep the language alive and show that it has never died. In Priscilla's video, Busting the Taino Extinction Myth, she explains the importance of Taino culture and language on Indigenous Peoples Day, and she says that the Taino language has always thrived. She says this in both English and Spanish, and we see it in words like hammock, iguana, hurricane, manatee, barbecue, potato, and canoe. With this, it has been proven that over 800 Taino words and phrases survived, and linguists like Javier Hernandez were able to use these remnants to create a modern-day Taino. So who is to say that robbing a people of its language is less violent than war? This is a quote by indigenous artist Ray Gwynne-Smith. She's an oil painter. That's some of her paintings. I have a language exercise for you all. Yay! So I'm going to teach you how to say hello and my name is in Taino. So first you'd say Taigwe, which means good day. And then you'd say Daktoka, which means to be. And then you'd say your name. So I'm going to go first and then you guys can go. Taigwe Daktoka Lio. And now you all go. Yay. Now you know one sentence in Taino. We're already actively revitalizing the language. So number 2, as I mentioned earlier, is shared values of a community that are passed down from generation to generation. So it is prevalent that within many indigenous cultures, elders are often seen as knowledge keepers. With the trauma they faced and withstood, such as residential schools, forced displacement, and being taken away from their families, they are proof of standing resilience and courage through generations of Native people. They uphold traditional Native values, language, and storytelling methods that continue to be passed down through generations. The definition of elder is dependent on tribal group. Some tribes even have elder declarations. So one example of this would be the Kanai people of the Blackfoot Confederacy and the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, which is a First Nations tribe. For example, having an elder declaration touches on responsibility, cultural upkeep, and governing rights. Although each tribe is different, there are common principles among elders, such as providing guidance and teaching important environmental and land relationships. It is important to note that not all old indigenous people are elders, so don't go up to random old Native people and ask them if they're an elder, guys. So to talk about the preservation of indigenous culture, we must analyze the problems that have caused it. Many Zapotecs in Mexico, for example, have been falsely imprisoned with no possibility of release. Most of the people imprisoned are elders and predominantly women. If we displace tribal elders, the stories, language, and culture lose one of their means of transmission for future generations. The Zapotec people are one of the indigenous people of southern Mexico, and the largest Zapotec population is currently in Oaxaca. The population of Zapotec peoples in Oaxaca is around 650,000. And most of them are in jail. So, how do we preserve the teachings of indigenous elders? What's actively being done to preserve these teachings? As I mentioned earlier, many indigenous peoples face discrimination and racism, and this discrimination and racism often affects elders as well. Because of this otherness, some elders have decided that not teaching their children and or grandchildren is the way to go. This is the case of Amador Martinez, a Zapotec elder who decided not to teach his children Zapotec for fear of discrimination and humiliation. He said in an interview with Universal Oaxaca, "It's a shame that I couldn't pass on Zapotec to my children. I didn't do it for fear that they would suffer discrimination, and now I'm fighting to conserve and teach Zapotec and also to recover our crops. Help us so that Zapotec does not die." Groups such as International Association for Indigenous Aging strive to share the experience of Indigenous elders while also working to give them the proper care they need. In order to preserve passing down culture generationally, it is important that Indigenous elders are getting proper care such as housing, food, and equal opportunities. With this care, they may be created a safe space that allows for language, stories, and culture to be passed down without shame. So this is a statistic of the US COVID death rates published in 2022 by the New York Times. As you can see, most of the death rates are Indigenous elders, sadly, which is kind of weird because the highest vaccination rates actually were amongst Indigenous elders. And I believe that this is because healthcare is really inaccessible, especially on reservations. So the Indian Health Service, a federal program that provides care to more than 2 million Native Americans, has a fraction of the funding on a per person basis received by Medicare, Medicaid, and or the Veterans Health Administration. And I can tell you that Medicare and Medicaid aren't so great on their own. So imagine that cut in half. Another quote I like by Gloria E. Anzaldúa, who wrote Borderlands / La Frontera, The New Mestiza. Highly recommend this book. This land was Mexican once, was Indian always, and is, and will be again. So number 3, I'm an art history major, so I'm going to go in depth with this one. It's going to be pretty long, guys. So number 3 is preserving and returning to indigenous peoples their artifacts while including a means to learn about indigenous creative practices within museums. So we cannot talk about preservation of artifacts without discussing NAGPRA. Bushstein NAGPRA, after the 2004 Kennewick man case, in which the remains were found of an indigenous man, and archaeologists had challenged the tribes who claimed this man, stating, "The skeleton is an irreplaceable source of information about early New World populations that warrants careful scientific inquiry to advocate knowledge of distant times." So what exactly is NAGPRA? NAGPRA is short for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act that was enacted on November 6th of 1990 in order to address the increase of stolen indigenous remains from burial grounds, sacred objects, funerary objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. In hindsight, it is supposed to ensure repatriation efforts are made by institutions. However, it is overall a positive thing. There are still loopholes in it. So first off, this only applies to federally recognized tribes in America, meaning that if we were to have something from a tribe in the Caribbean, such as the Taino, we wouldn't have to give it back because they're not federally recognized. Second off, more often than not, institutions find their own loopholes to take. An example of this is the fact that the remains of an indigenous person need to be deemed culturally identifiable. And this seems reasonable. However, this means that like anthropologists or those claiming such remnants or objects need to be able to identify cultural categories that can pinpoint these remnants to federally recognized tribes. The word federal is in there once again. And according to National NAGPRA Program Fiscal Year 2020 report, in fiscal years 1990 through 2020, agencies repatriated 91.5% of the humans remain in their collections that were culturally affiliated with a present-day Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization, which is a good thing. But then the report also notes that more work is needed, especially to repatriate more than 116,000 Native American human remains that are still in collections, of which 95% have not been culturally identified. And this is obviously due to displacement, European disease, and the effects of war. Another example is Christie's auction house. So these are all in Christie's collection right now. Nope, no, it's not. This was in their collection, but they auctioned it off. Many people think that museums have acquired the objects they have by fair means. And even if they haven't, why should it matter, right? It is no secret that due to colonization and forced relocation of indigenous peoples, artifacts and even remains and bones of ancestors have disappeared. In 2021, a protest took place in front of Christie's auction house in Manhattan. Christie's planned to sell 38 Taino artworks and artifacts from the Taino collection of Fior Arts. With this, Mayan and Mescala pieces were being sold as well. Christie's justified the sale of these works and their non-return to the Taino by saying, "As custodians of the art that passes through our doors, we recognize that we have a duty to carefully research the art and objects we handle and sell. We devote considerable resources to investigating the provenance of the works we offer for sale, and we have specific procedures in place, including the requirement that our sellers provide proof of ownership. In the case of the upcoming sale, these checks have been carried out, and we have no reason to believe that the properties of illicit provenance or that its sale would be contrary to French law." Some of the Tainos up for grabs, which have now been auctioned off, as I said, range from $5,000 to $200,000, and the collection includes manatee bone ritual spatula used in ceremonies, shell ornaments, and stone three-pointers that depict deities. Many of the works which came from a private collection have been loaned and displayed, and at many well-known museums throughout the world. That's what Christie said. So in the auction quarters, it was stated that the Taino people were wiped out in the mid-1500s. And with the statistics I provided you guys earlier, this was deemed not true, but they still used this. Also, I'm standing in front of you, so we are not dead. At least we're not all dead. These items are being advertised as art pieces, which is false. For example, let's see if this works. This piece up here is known as a zemis, which is said to hold the figures and spirits of ancestors. So they're very important culturally and usually are placed within homes or as honor on funeral ground. So as I mentioned earlier, Christie's does not have to give any of this back because the Taino people are not federally recognized. And that's the loophole. Another big thing with museums is the narrative of extinction. Surprisingly, the extinction myth and vanishing race myth is still being used by institutions to this day. I give you the example of the Taino Museum, also known as the first Taino Museum in Haiti, which have their main page right here if you want to follow along. So their page states, the Tainos became extinct as a culture after the settlement of the Spanish colonists, mainly due to infectious diseases against which they had no immunity. The first recorded outbreak of smallpox on Hispaniola occurred in December 1518 or January 1519. The smallpox epidemic of 1518 killed 90% of the natives who had not yet perished. Warfare and the harsh enslavement of the colonists also caused many deaths. By 1548, the native population had dwindled to less than 500. However, this is false, as I've said earlier, and the language and culture are continuing to thrive and be revitalized to this day. So I'm wondering why they don't have that on their main page. And this again shows how they're implementing the idea of the vanishing race. To my left here, or my right, this is a picture taken by Edward S. Curtis titled The Vanishing Race. It's used in a lot of museums to this day. I've seen it in the Natural History Museum. I worked there for a summer, which was, yeah. Here he states that basically the native people were vanishing and they had no idea why. And that's basically his whole stick. He is pretty much a white savior who was funded by people such as J.P. Morgan, who actively aided in displacing native people for gold and oil. So J.P. Morgan actually had help in like moving people to reservations. He was funding Edward S. Curtis, who was taking pictures of native people and saying, how are they being wiped out? What's happening, guys? Man's new. So how do we better return artifacts to indigenous peoples? While exposure to outside groups may be a factor for any culture to thrive, the transmission of artifacts and artistic practices is just as important, if not more. If most of indigenous nations' own history is preserved for them with no guarantee that they will be able to access these artifacts, then how can they preserve their own history? One institute that is making headway in this regard is the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, which I would like to point out has a lot of people working there who are indigenous, and they actively search out to hire indigenous people. The museum has staff dedicated to the repatriation program, in which, upon request and in collaboration with First Nation leaders, sacred objects and artifacts are returned to their rightful tribes. In this way, objects such as regalia are passed down from generation to generation and to family members, giving rise to a thriving and unforgotten history. Their repatriation steps are accessible online for everyone to see, which I also think is great. Margaret Brucock is an indigenous anthropology professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and she's looking to introduce decolonizing methods into anthropology and museums overall. She says, and I quote, "We need to reevaluate and reconsider the disproportionately large role that dominant white male American anthropologists have been allowed to play in shaping public conception of Indian identity and materiality. The most intensive collecting came during an era when Native communities were struggling with forced relocation, education, and increased urbanization." Brucock notes, by repositioning, if not altogether removing, indigenous stories, objects, and traditions, anthropologists claim to be advancing scientific knowledge, but in the process, they often alienated people from their own culture. In conclusion, she and I believe the answer to this is close and careful collaboration, giving credit where credit is due, and acknowledging the faults in American history. Museums who work in close collaboration with tribes can also learn more from firsthand experience, rather than getting their information from scholarly sources whom are more than often white. Number 4, awareness and action. There are many problems Indigenous people face in modern day, especially Indigenous women. In 2020, there were 5,295 reports of Native women who went missing in the US alone. In Mexico, the cases of Indigenous women being murdered have increased by 137%. In general, the rate of femicide in Mexico has gone up to 135%. How can one be resilient when the women in their community are being murdered and going missing at disturbing rates? Due to systemic racism and sexism, reports of Indigenous women being missing have gone ignored or have not been recorded and or reported on as frequently as they should be. One disturbing case that shows this is Monica Fasthorse's case. Her and her 26-year-old daughter live in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Although the police did check her home and the apartment her daughter had last been seen at, no missing persons report had been properly placed. No news outlets had gone back to Fast Horse, and when asking the officers why they hadn't been prioritizing her case, they replied with, "There are other cases to prioritize." This is more than often the response Indigenous families hear when they try to report missing relatives, especially if those relatives are women. The National Crime Information Center reports that in 2016, there were 5,712 reports of missing American Indian and Alaskan Native women and girls through the U.S. Department of Justice's Federal Missing Persons Database. NAM US only logged 116 of those cases. This was found in a report by Abigail Echo Hawk and Anita Lucchesi. Also, Indigenous women make up 4% of Canada's population and are somehow 25% of its female homicide victims in a report found in 2012. On a brighter note, how are things changing? Due to the police and government constantly ignoring their cries for help, families of missing and murdered victims have created their own organizations and nonprofits to bring awareness to the cause. One of the many organizations that are fighting for change is Native Hope. On their website, they bring awareness to the rates at which Indigenous women are going missing and why it is important to educate yourself on the cause. They also organize protests and allow people to donate to the organization. This organization is only one of many examples in which Indigenous people remain resilient through hard times. Another example is the website National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. The NIWRC, National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, is working in partnership with the National Congress of American Indians Task Force and sister organizations to inform Congress and urge it to act. Efforts at all levels of tribal, state, and federal government are required to begin making the changes needed. The movement has and continue to compel action by members of Congress. This power to generate change rests in the hands of local organizers. And this is on the main page of the NIWRC's website. So even though in 2019, 6 bills were introduced in the Senate and House to recognize, study, and increase the coordination and response of law enforcement agencies to the MMIW crisis. The same year, Congress failed to pass a single law addressing the MMIW crisis. So there's stuff being done, but there can always be more done. So this is their 6-point action plan, which is also located on their website. I heavily urge you guys to visit it. It's like a great learning center. So to sum it up, some of the main points are recognition, implementation, respect, and the removal of systemic barriers. So Jack D. Forbes is a great author, and I read this book 2 summers ago. Highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite books now. It's called Columbus and Other Cannibals, The Wedico Disease of Exploitation, Imperialism, and Terrorism. He also talks about decolonization and how to decolonize your mind within the book. I can lose my hands and still live. I can lose my legs and still live. I can lose my eyes and still live. I can lose my hair, eyebrows, nose, arms, and many other things and still live. But if I lose the air, I die. If I lose the sun, I die. If I lose the earth, I die. If I lose the water, I die. If I lose the plants and animals, I die. All of these things are more a part of me, more essential to my every breath than my so-called body. What is my real body? And with that, I get to my last point, decolonizing spaces and the act of land back. So Indigenous authors Wazia Tawin and Michael Yellowbird define decolonization as the meaningful and active resistance to the forces of colonialism that perpetuate the subjugation and or exploitation of our minds, bodies, and lands. Its ultimate purpose is to overturn the colonial structure and realize Indigenous liberation. Decolonizing, especially for non-Indigenous people, also means unlearning colonial mindsets. This could be in small steps, such as educating yourself on whose land you live on and how it came to be that those land rights were taken away from said people. Also realize that we live in a society with Eurocentric standards. A good example of this is the modern day gender debate, whether or not there are 2 genders, but Two-Spirit people have always existed. I personally identify as Two-Spirit. We have lived within Indigenous tribes for years and are often looked up to for most part. The idea that it is abnormal is actually a colonial perspective. And this also applies to beauty standards such as big noses and brown skin, you know, things like that. There's often a colonialist justification for ethnic cleansing, and usually it centers around land rights. We've seen this with Manifest Destiny, and now we're seeing it again with Palestine. We loop in a circle and we allow ethnic cleansing and genocide to happen right under our noses. So educate yourself, check your resources, and do not let history continuously repeat itself. Overall, we live in a colonial system. Society is structured the way it is because Eurocentric ideology continues to thrive and persist. Now I will get into land back. And this is an often very scary topic for people. So I will explain it as thoroughly as I can. So land back is a movement that has existed for generations with a long legacy of organizing and sacrifice to get indigenous lands back into indigenous hands. Currently, there are land back battles being fought all across Turtle Island, to the north and the south. This was on the land back official website, which is run by Indian Collective. The land back movement was formally created by artist Aaron Tailfeathers in 2018 as a hashtag, and has since been branded. However, land back does not mean tribal nations want to reclaim their lands and force everybody to leave, because that would be genocide. So article I read recently titled "How the Land Back Movement is Unraveling Manifest Destiny" really helped me to learn what I already knew what the land back movement was about, but it really helped expand my thinking. And the author states, across the United States, more than half the land within reservation boundaries is controlled by non-Indians, the result of 19th century federal laws that allowed white settlers and corporations to snatch up reservation lands during westward expansion. This is true for the Boy Fort Band of Chippewa, located in Minnesota, which owns less than half of the area within the 3 sections of its reservation. So we have that little Idaho-shaped land, and less than half of that is actually ours, which is kind of upsetting. The US Congress passed the General Allotment Act of 1887, which divided and distributed reservation land to tribal individuals and opened up the remaining surplus lands for purchase by non-natives and corporations. And that's how the checkerboard of ownership happened, and the jumble of different jurisdictions led to tension between tribal members and non-natives living or working on reservation territory. This author managed to sum up, I believe, perfectly how land back can be done in a sufficient manner. And she says, by my count, in the past 2 decades, there have been at least 100 tribal land recoveries involving some 73 state or federally recognized tribes, an intertribal coalition, and 6 indigenous-owned land trusts. Altogether, these recoveries have secured over 420,000 acres for Native peoples. Indian lands have been recovered through a variety of means: outright land title purchases, donations from private landowners, transfers from land conservancies, and federal and state legislation, including long overdue recognition of tribes that didn't have legal status. So that is one way that land back can be done sufficiently. And also, all of these territorial recoveries are the ways in which land back as a movement are working in current day. So it is obvious that most famous landmarks and national parks were once the homes of indigenous peoples. Such an example is Mount Rushmore. In the late 1800s, Euro-American settlers began pushing into the Black Hills, igniting a war with the indigenous population. The US government signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, giving the Lakota exclusive use of the Black Hills. Within a decade, however, gold was discovered in the region, and in 1877, the US broke the treaty and took over the land. This is only one of many treaties America has broken with indigenous people. It is estimated that around 368 treaties from just the years of 1778 to 1871 had been broken. Most, if not all, national park land, as I stated earlier, once belonged to indigenous people. There's a preconceived notion that this land is better off in the hands of the government, and that there's no way indigenous peoples will do a better job than the government. But Australia's 2021 State of the Environment report on Statista said, despite the fact indigenous peoples make up around 15% of the world's extreme poor and just 5% of the global population, they are protecting 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. So if you ask me, I'd say we're doing a pretty damn good job. And that basically concludes my talk. So thank you for listening, and thank you for giving me the space to discuss really important issues that I hold very dear to my heart.
Questions for Leo?
Hi.
For it to be heard by people watching on Zoom. Thank you.
I was wondering, since you are studying art history, if you could speak from an art historian perspective of how you think we should go about including the indigenous cultures in institutions.
Yeah, so I actually, as I stated, worked at the Natural History Museum. That's what we call it in the city. I know the name's longer. And they recently got rid of their Plain Indians exhibit, which I thought was pretty problematic because I found this out while I was working there. They use the same mold for every Native person, despite gender. And so they decided to bring in a new exhibit called the Northern Tribe exhibit, I believe, in which they had a giant boat on the ceiling blessed by a Native tribe. They had a documentary displayed about how Native people are being displaced at disproportionate rates. I sat down during one of my lunch breaks and watched it, and it made me cry. They also have art by Indigenous people there as well. I think including more collaboration, as I stated earlier, and just letting Indigenous people tell their own stories in some cases usually works better from what I've learned. So, yeah.
Other questions? Oh. Well, let somebody else first, and then I'll bring it back to you.
It seems we need to renovate elementary school, junior high, high school history so that from the very beginning, people are realizing how many different kinds of people exist in our land and on our planet, and to celebrate each one of them and to be really honest about the things other people have done to other groups. We're really going to let history help stop repeating itself. We need to learn the truth.
Yeah, I agree. Well said.
I'm currently working with a lot of found natural materials on Alfred land. And I was just curious if you are working also with like medicine or any plants that indigenous people have included in their culture.
So that's a good question. I am not. However, I am Indigenous, and my mom used to make this nasty drink for me whenever I got sick, and it had like so much ginger in it and so much like grass and just like herb stuff. And I remember she told me, well, your grandmother used to give this to me and it would make me feel better. So I think this doesn't kind of answer your question, but I think there's within modern times, people are still using these medicines and they don't even know it. But I'm not a scholar on anything in terms of plants or stuff like that. But that's really cool that you're working with that stuff. You should talk to some Seneca people.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I really want to, because I feel like it's important if I'm using these materials to like understand them deeper than just like, because there is a history of the land and the plants that grow on it.
Yeah.
And also if I can ask one more question, you mentioned let's see where my question was. How would we go about getting like the Taino federally recognized or any other indigenous culture?
So that's a good question. It is being done by the Federation itself. But the only way to really do it is reach out to the government. I would recommend that if anyone wants to actively participate in that, go on the Taino federal website. And I believe they have an About Us page where you can help donate and things like that. But as I said, it's all bureaucratically done. So there's not much they can do except go to the government, which they've been doing, as I showed with Elba Anaka Lugo, who held the Taino Symposium. That was the first of its kind, and it was like amazing. It's on YouTube. Highly recommend watching it.
I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first is when you talk about cultural artifacts,
Mm-hmm.
it occurs to me that one kind of cultural artifact is, say, music, or another is dance, another is stories and poetry and songs and poems. And it strikes me that in terms of educating all of us about indigenous culture, those kinds of artifacts could be very effective because, first of all, they're more accessible than things in a museum. And so I wondered if you've got recommendations in terms of, say, stories or songs or music That was my first question.
Okay. There's a Cree band I really like a lot that's on Spotify. They sing, look up Red Rock Woman on Spotify, everyone. It's a great song. That's a good song, I think, if you want to learn more about indigenous music. I don't know. Huh? Oh yeah, Project 360, which I knew about. Project 360 is also another great program in which this photographer is taking pictures of modern day indigenous people and letting them tell their stories. Also, Will Wilson, who I mentioned earlier, if you go onto his website, he has pictures that he takes of indigenous people and has all their stories and video interviews as well. Highly recommend checking out those artists.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
My other question is, a couple of times you mentioned Australia, you mentioned Canada, you mentioned Mexico, and I wondered if this is just my own ignorance, but I wondered if there's any international organization that sort of helps Indigenous people campaign, as an international kind of group.
I'm unsure. I know as far as my education goes, I'm pretty sure that it's all kept within the realms just because the cultures are so different and things like that, or I don't know, it's just how the government works, but I'm pretty sure there is. I mean, I wouldn't shoot that down. There probably is. I have to look more into that.
Hi,
Hi.
I just wanted to start off by saying thank you because I'm also Taino. And I grew up with the notion that we were extinct, that, Columbus destroyed everything that had to do with us. And it wasn't until I got to college that I realized, my friend got me a DNA test and I was like, oh, yeah, that adds up. I'm Taino, that makes sense. But I grew up with the notion that there wasn't much for me to reference in terms of Taino culture. So I'm just wondering if you have any resources where I could see more art and see more like things relating to the culture.
So 100%, I would recommend Priscilla Colon. As I mentioned before, she's very accessible. You could just look her up on YouTube. She's also very open with her emails as well. If you ever want to contact her, she's one of the leaders within the Taino movement right now, as I mentioned earlier. Also, I would read up on Javier Hernandez, who I also mentioned. He has books where you can learn Taino and about the Taino revitalization movement. Elba Anakalugo, she works in preserving indigenous music and Taino music. So I would definitely look at her talks as well. Within her talks, she references elders who I'm pretty sure you could learn a lot from on YouTube as well. Mm-hmm.
I just want to say that was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much for that. My question is, do you have any thoughts, ideas, recommendations, what we can do as a university, what we can do locally to support Native and Indigenous people?
Yeah, well, I had a show 2 semesters ago in which I talked about land acknowledgement. And although it is an overall positive thing, it can be performative if you're not donating or actively giving Indigenous people resources. I think one thing that we could do better as a school collective is work with more people on the Seneca Nation. I think it's odd that we're so close to them and we barely integrate them in any of our studies. So I think that would be the first step. I think also just like I said, educating yourself, donating if you can, things like that.
Well, if there's nothing else, please join me in thanking Lio for an outstanding talk. Thank you. And I'll talk to the tech people about editing what you said about the drink that your mom made before we share it with your family.
Okay, thank you. She knows. She knows I hate that drink. Do I just exit out?